Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and as always, I am happy to have you join me for another author interview. Today has been a good day. It is the birthday of one of my dearest friends. I haven't seen her in a few years, and I definitely haven't seen her in the last year with the quarantine, but we chat and we've been in contact, and I just think she is probably the kindest person I have ever met. I aspire to be as kind as she is. We were actually roommates in grad school for a year and just cemented our friendship forever. She actually participated in my wedding, and I just can't say enough good things about her. And least of all, or maybe, I don't know, but part of that friendship is our love of books. We have had so many conversations about books and what we love about them, which books we love, why we love them, which books we were not maybe as thrilled about, but, childhood books that we're still nostalgic about. We've given each other books. We've given each other childhood books that we've been nostalgic about, and just so many good conversations around books and a million different other things. So I want to wish her a happy birthday. She's just, again, one of the dearest dearest people on the face of the planet, and I am so grateful to have her in my life. So saying, let's talk about the book and the author that we are talking about. And today, the book is called Catalyst. The author is Tracy Richardson. This is a book that is part of a series, the Catalyst series, but can be read as a standalone. The books are actually part of a series, but they feature brother and sister, so there's different main characters in a couple of the books, done from the different perspectives of the brother and sister characters. This one features Marcy Horton, and it is the second in this series, the Catalysts series. And the description of the book is as follows. Marcy Horton has a sixth sense. Not in the I see dead people way, but, well, maybe a little. She feels a sort of knowing about certain things that can't be explained, an intuition that goes beyond the normal. Then there was that one summer 4 years ago when she connected with a long-departed spirit. But nothing that incredible has happened to Marcy since. This summer, Marcy is spending time working at Angel Mounds, the archaeological dig her mother heads, along with her brother Eric and his girlfriend Renee. The dig is the site of an ancient indigenous civilization, and things immediately shift into the paranormal when Marcy and her teammates meet Lorraine and Zeke. The two mysterious dig assistants reveal their abilities to access the universal energy field and with their minds, something Marcy knows only vaguely that her brother has also had experience with. Marcy learns how our planet will disintegrate if action is not taken, and she and her team must decide if they are brave enough to help Lorraine and Zeke in their plan to save Mother Earth, her resources, and her history. It looks like the summer just got a lot more interesting. So that is the description of Catalyst. Again, the author is Tracy Richardson. It is book 2 of the Catalyst series. And as you can see, there's a lot happening in this story. So you've got the kind of paranormal aspect. You've got some fantasy going on here with the ability to connect with the spirits and do those things. But you've got some science fiction as well with the universal energy field and some studies that are being done. There is her work that summer with her mother's group at the archaeological dig, and also there is a group that moves in to begin fracking in the area, and so her family's farm is near where the fracking is going to be, so they start working against this company coming in to do the fracking. Of course, they're dealing with farmers and people who own land who are, could use the extra money from allowing the fracking on their land. So there's these different ideologies happening. There's different moral sensibilities, and you get a lot of different layers. So in addition to the fracking, to the archaeological dig, then they meet Lorraine and Zeke and learn that there's so much more to all of this, and that if something isn't done, they see a vision of the future and how that future will look if something is not done, not just at the local level dealing with the fracking issue, but also on a global and even kind of cosmic level in terms of healing the planet and moving forward in ways that will actually leave a planet for the next generations. So you've got some of those great tropes, with the hero's journey. You've got a young woman who maybe doesn't see herself as any kind of heroine, although she, has some incredible abilities, and she had that encounter with a spirit in her past, and then she begins to encounter other spirits. So it's a coming of age story. It's a story of young relationships, of friendship, of budding romance, of these mentorships with Lorraine and Zeke, and just a lot of growth and experiences and knowledge that Marcy gains as a young woman. I think she's 14 in the book, on this path. So it's a lot. There's some crossing of genres, and I like that it is a young woman who's not only involved in this sort of paranormal fantasy element, but she's working the archaeological dig. There's some STEM involved, so she's a very well-rounded young woman, and I definitely appreciate that about her as the main character. So let's go ahead now and turn to the interview with Tracy Richardson. Again, the book is called Catalyst.
Hi, Tracy. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
I am very happy to have you here, and we are here to talk about your book, Catalyst, and also the series, the Catalyst series. Before we get to those books, though, if you could start by telling a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Sure. So I have a degree in biology. And while I didn't go that direction for my career, I thought at one point that I would be a doctor, but didn't go that path. I am a self-avowed science geek, and really fascinated with all things about the universe and science and things that new discoveries that may happen. So I use that in my writing. And I'm also very passionate about the environment. So there are environmental themes in my writing as well. I consider myself to be a maker, so I'm a creative person. So I write, but I knit, I sew, I paint, I cook. I'm always doing something. In fact, someone told me the other day, I've never seen you without a needle in your hand, because when I do Zoom calls, I'm knitting because I like to be busy. And I'm a doer. Someone said to me one time, well, why can't you just be a human being instead of a human doing? But that's what I am like. That's the person that I am. So that's kind of me.
I am actually crocheting as we speak.
Oh, wow. They're perfect. I'm not, because I need to focus on what I'm saying, but normally I would be. What are you making? Anything special?
Christmas ornaments. I'm running a little behind, but
I just finished some sweaters.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I totally understand, though, when I was in a different profession and I had a lot of meetings that would take place over multiple days, I would always take a project with me. Otherwise, I just couldn't sit there.
Yeah. And the nice thing about crocheting and knitting is that they are portable. So whereas you can't really bring your easel and paint, or you can't bring your sewing machine and sew, but you can knit and crochet while you're sitting in a meeting or talking with friends or whatever you're doing.
Right. And then you can impress people when you're not looking at your project, but still.
Right. Exactly.
But we're here to talk about books, I suppose, and not crafting.
Right. That's another show.
Right. So the Catalyst series is interesting because we're here to talk about the book Catalyst, and that focuses on a young woman named Marcy. But in the story, there are lots of references to another summer in her life, and that is a book called Indian Summer. But when I went to your website, that is a prequel, correct?
Yes.
So that one's not out yet.
Well, so the way that worked, Indian Summer was the first book that I wrote. I wrote that about I started writing it about 15 years ago, and it was published, but it was with a very small publishing company and didn't get a lot of attention. So my new publisher is going to re-release that as a prequel, because it is a prequel. But at the end of the Catalyst series, and I've rewritten quite a bit of it and changed some things around. It was my first book, so it was pretty rough. So I feel really fortunate to have that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. So since it has been out in some form or another, let's start there. Can you start with that story and how it leads into the series?
Sure. So Indian Summer started really as an idea based on my family has a lake cottage, and on that lake there was a wealthy property owner who was changing the way the road was going in order to really essentially give them a bigger front yard, is what I thought. And that, but it also made a walking path for the community. And I sort of thought, well, because they have money, they get to do what they want under the guise of giving this walking path to the community, when really it just gave them a huge front yard buffer from the public. So Indian Summer is about wealthy property owner on a lake that's similar to the lake that my family had a house on, and that they are wanting to develop old growth forest into McMansions. So it's sort of as Marcy, who's 12 in Indian Summer, so it's a middle grade novel. She and her friends are trying to stop this development from happening. So it's a comparison of the wealthy landowners, different people from different social and economic classes, and then there's an environmental theme through that as well, with this old growth forest that they're trying to protect.
Okay, and then but then there's the sort of I don't know if metaphysical is the right word for
right.
it, but there's the other aspect, and I think that's important because that leads into what happens in Catalyst. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's hugely important. So all of them have a metaphysical, supernatural theme to them. And in Indian Summer, Marcy is visited by the spirit of a Native American girl who helps her figure out how they're going to address trying to stop this development from happening. And then when I rewrote it, I also added more in with the trees themselves in this old growth forest. I read some really wonderful books. One in particular was The Secret Life of Trees, I think is what it's called. It might be The Hidden Life of Trees, where it talks about how trees communicate with each other through their leaves and their roots, and it was fascinating. And I read some other books about how plants have a kind of consciousness. Not all of us would necessarily say that they're conscious, obviously, in the way that we are, but they have a kind of consciousness. In fact, everything does, and that's a theme throughout all the books. But Marcy is able to communicate with this Native American girl. And then, that comes into play in Catalyst as well. Do you want me to go ahead and talk about Catalyst?
Yeah, that's great. Go ahead and segue right into that.
Okay, so in Catalyst, Marcy is now a junior in high school, and she is on an archaeological dig site with Mississippian culture. It's a sort of a fictionalized site that I morphed a bunch of real sites into my fictionalized site. But she connects with the people, the indigenous communities that were there, that they're excavating this site. She's able to connect with them, and then also that's sort of a side story in the book. But what happens is they meet two mysterious dig assistants, Zeke and Lorraine, and they claim to be able to access the universal energy field with their thoughts. And that's something that comes into play in The Field, which is the book that Marcy's brother Eric is the protagonist, and he accesses the universal energy field with his thoughts. So, and then in Catalyst, they're really, these two big assistants are saying, you know, Earth is in a crisis at this point, and if we don't do something about the environmental damage, that we'll destroy ourselves. The Earth will probably not be destroyed, but she might just throw us all off into space and then start over without us. So Marcy's really called into task to do her part, and her friends as well, to try and stop that from happening. Mm-hmm. And then in The Field, so Marcy's brother Eric, who is in The Field, is a junior in high school also. He accesses the universal energy field with his thoughts. So there's really two ways to look at the universal energy field. One is this collective consciousness. And I find when I talk to readers and other interviews that I do, that everyone has had some kind of experience with this. You could call it extrasensory perception or intuition, but it's when you maybe get an idea that something's going on with your friend or your mother or your child, and then you reach out to that person and find out, yeah, there was something happening with them. So you connected with them, and people just take it for granted, but it's a real phenomena that people study. So I wanted to write about that and how it would actually work in someone's real life.
Okay, let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking about the books in the series and chronologically what order they fall in, but again, they aren't sequels to one another necessarily. You can read them all as standalone books, but if you want to know the chronological order, then you should definitely stay tuned. I'll be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
I was speaking with author Tracy Richardson. Well, actually, she was speaking about some of the premises of her book and that feeling that you sometimes have when you kind of know something has happened or you sense something is happening, and how that so many different people have had that experience in their own life. Maybe you yourself have had similar experiences. So actually, you know, I would love to hear about those experiences if you have had them, and I bet Tracy would as well. So find us on social media and let us know about those experiences if you have had them. In the meantime, let's go ahead and turn back to the interview with Tracy.
And so The Field, then, the events of The Field take place before the events of Catalyst. Are they after Indian Summer?
Yes. So the books are not sequels per se. They're sort of companion books because it's the same characters. But Indian Summer, Marcy is 12, and in The Field, Marcy is 14, and Eric, who's her older brother, is, I think he's 17 in The Field. And then in Catalyst, which comes after The Field, Marcy is now 17, and Eric is 19. And so, like I said, they're standalone books. There are some references to things that happen in the previous books, but nothing that is going to stop you from being able to read it individually. But it does help, I think, to read them in order a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely read them as standalones. There's just a lot of, references where you're like, there's more to that story.
Right.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more about Marcy as the main character. What about her do you think might resonate with readers?
So in the beginning, in Indian Summer, she's in middle school. She's 12. She's dealing with this popular girl. She's feeling uncertain and uncomfortable about herself and her place in the world. And as she goes through this process, she realizes that she doesn't necessarily have to please other people, and she finds a lot of strength in herself and her own ideals and morals. So Marcy's really driven quite a bit by her own moral compass and ethical ideas. And then she's kind of a minor character in the field. She's there, but she's not a really she doesn't have a big role to play. But in Catalyst, she feels like there's something missing in her life. She remembers what happened when she connected with the Native American girl. She really loves that feeling of connection, and she feels like something's missing in her life when Catalyst opens. And then as the events progress in Catalyst, it feels like she's finally found her meaning and her purpose in connecting through the universal energy field, through the collective consciousness, in trying to save the earth from environmental destruction. So my son, in fact, read Catalyst and said, Mom, Marcy, no one's going to like Marcy. She's kind of a jerk. And so, because she was very, very strong about her ideals, and didn't really give a lot of leeway for other opinions. So I toned it down quite a bit. So she's someone that you can identify with because she struggles with doing the right thing, finding her path, and she's frustrated when other people aren't necessarily on board with her. So she's flawed, and through the book, she really develops her own sense of self even more strongly than she did in Indian Summer, and becomes pretty confident about her ability to recognize the things that are important to her and follow through on those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's definitely a strong young woman, and a strong-willed young woman. You see some of not the jerk aspect necessarily, but you see some of that. You see some of that difficulty that she has dealing with people who don't agree with her. There's another storyline throughout the book about fracking, and
yes.
She has some trouble dealing with people who have different opinions than she does on the subject.
Right. Yeah, each book has an environmental theme, and fracking is the theme in Catalyst. They discovered that big oil companies are going to be fracking in southern Indiana, and so they're trying to oppose them from doing that. And yeah, she doesn't understand how. There's another character, Leo, who's also a romantic interest, who's a fracking proponent, and she says, there's really nothing good about fracking. And he says, well, there's economic benefits from it, and other things that are helpful. But yeah, she just really doesn't understand why he has that position. And then the environmental theme in the field is the comparison between, so the other component of the universal energy field is this idea that in any cubic inch of space, there's enough energy to power, say, New York City for a day. If we could figure out how to access this energy. So if you think about it, there's energy flowing through the air all the time. We've got our cell phones, we have microwaves, we have radiation, we have television, radio, all that. So there's this idea that there's also this energy, dark energy, some people have called it, that we can access. And so the idea is if we could access that energy, we wouldn't need to burn fossil fuels. We wouldn't need nuclear energy. So in the field, it compares burning fossil fuels, some dirty energy, to clean energy sources like hydro and wind energy, solar, and then this idea of the universal energy field too.
I have to go a bit off topic here and say that, excuse me, I don't know if you are a science fiction fan in terms of television series, but the television series, oh shoot, it just popped right out of my head. Battlestar Galactica has ruined the word fracking for me. Because they use the word, it has ruined the word fracking for me. Because, not that it's a great word, but they use it as, their version of the F word to get around the censor.
Oh, that's funny. Well, I think it's appropriate in this place. I'm certainly not a proponent of fracking.
Right, it kind of is, but it gives me a little giggle every time I read the word because I hear it in a different context.
Yeah, that's funny.
So, let's talk a little bit more about. We've talked about Marcy and we've talked a little bit about Eric. Why did you decide to write books in this series from differing points of view?
Well, as a writer, I never started when I started writing Indian Summer thinking, oh, this is going to be a series. But I wrote Indian Summer, and then I started getting ideas for The Field. I read a book called The Field by Lynn McTaggart. It's a nonfiction book, and it talks about this whole universal energy field idea. And I started thinking that I wanted to write something fiction, including that, to really get the idea out to a wider audience, because I think fiction is a great teacher and it can present ideas in ways that might be a little more palatable to some people. So when I started thinking about that, my son at the time was a high school soccer goalkeeper, and my ex-husband had been a soccer player, and my father-in-law had been a soccer player. So soccer was sort of all over the place in my house. And being a soccer goalkeeper lent itself to having this connection, which Eric does. He knows where the ball's going to go before it gets there. So he kind of connects to the universal energy field a split second beforehand. So the idea of the soccer character lent itself to the story. So the stories often sort of write themselves. I mean, the ideas come, and you really have to just go with it. And so Eric was the character for the next book. That's just what made the most sense at the time. Marcy is a track and field sports person, so that just didn't have the same connections or ability to use the universal energy field connection as a soccer goalkeeper.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And how was it switching from writing from a young woman's perspective to writing from a young man's perspective?
Well, that's interesting because I've had people tell me that they were reading the book, and so Tracy as a name can also be a man's name, and that they didn't realize that I was a woman until they met me in person. And my boyfriend, my boyfriend, he read the book before we ever met. We connected on the internet, and he, after reading it, said, "So were you in sports, or did you have brothers? So, how did you write this?" And I think that I just, my son, like I said, was in soccer, and we went to the practices. He played soccer for a decade probably. So I just was observing, and I feel like I just, I don't know, got into the head of a teenage boy and what they would be thinking. But it's quite satisfying when people do say that I got it right. And each character that I write, they're not me, but they have a little bit of me in them. So I ran track like Marcy did, and I'm fairly competitive. So I think I just kind of knew what he would be thinking. And then I watched so the kids in high school used to come hang out at my house. And so I would just listen to them talk. They'd, talk pretty openly in front of me about whatever was going on. And I would just be in the corner, like taking notes. Oh, this will be good to put in the book, or that'll be good. So it wasn't that hard, really.
Yeah, nice. Do you plan on other books in the series?
Yes. So after Catalyst, Catalyst ends with the opportunity for a sequel. So I'm writing the sequel to Catalyst, which is the third book in the series but it'll be my fourth book if you include Indian Summer. And Catalyst, so actually if I go back, I had tried to write Catalyst from both Marcy and Eric's point of view originally, but I did a terrible job. And I had my brothers read it for me. One of my brothers is also an author, and they said, this does not work. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. So I had to go back and rewrite the whole thing just from one of their perspectives, and it made sense for it to be Marcy. But in Catalyst, in book 3, the sequel, which I haven't titled yet, I am writing it from both Marcy and Eric's point of view. And it's almost like two separate books because Marcy is in one location and Eric is in a completely different location, and they're having two completely different experiences. And so I'm trying to figure the best way to link them together throughout the book. But that will be the conclusion of the series, at least, as I know it right now. Who knows what other ideas will come, and I'm about 150 pages into that book, and I expect that there'll probably be another 200 to 300 more pages, since it's almost like writing two books.
Mm-hmm. Fun.
Yeah.
And then that is possibly the final book in the series, but your characters might have other ideas.
Exactly. And it's so true. And you said when we talked earlier that you've interviewed over 100 authors, and I hear other authors say the same thing. I have an idea of what I'm going to write about, but when I sit down and start writing, it's like the story just kind of flows through me, and these ideas come and the characters do different things. So you just never know what's going to happen exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm always fascinated to find out, to listen to authors, and you can kind of tell if they identify as plotters or pantsers or something in between. There's the ones that have to have an outline and have to know exactly where the book is going, and then there's authors who are like, I just sit down and start writing, and then I figure it out as I go along.
Yeah.
And I can just imagine that both groups kind of cringe at the other way of writing.
Right. Well, I'm really a little bit of both. I have an outline. It's a very rough outline, and I know what I want to happen at the end. That doesn't necessarily mean that's always exactly what happens, but so I work from an outline, but I definitely and I write in scenes. So each scene is a chapter or a number of chapters, and then after that's done, then I never really have writer's block, fortunately, thankfully. But I might be finished with a scene, and then I have to sort of wait to figure out what the next scene is going to be, and I'll do research or work on something else to let that percolate a little bit.
Time for a second break. I love listening to authors talk about characters who take on a life of their own, who determine that the book is going to go in a different direction than the authors think they were. I think maybe being an author is the ultimate giving up of control. In some ways, you do have a lot of control, but then in others, I feel like you have to let go. And what is that phrase? Let go and let God. This is let go and just let your characters do what they think what they need to do in order to move the plot along. We're going to take that second break. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back. Pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets podcast is for you. Before the break, Tracy and I were talking about characters running amok. Okay, maybe that's a little dramatic, but characters and them having maybe some different ideas as to, is the series going to end? Is the series not going to end? They definitely have their own opinions sometimes. But let's go ahead and turn back to the interview with Tracy Richardson. Again, the book is Catalyst. It is the second book in the Catalysts series.
You mentioned that there's a little bit of you in each character. Are there other autobiographical elements throughout your books?
Well, oh yeah, absolutely. Like Marcy, their parents, their mother is very much like me in some ways, not like me in a lot of ways, but there's a lot of me in that. So Indian Summer was, like I said, it's a fictionalized version of the lake where my family had a lake house. So and then there's some characters like there's a character, Al DePena, who's based on my ex-mother-in-law's boyfriend who lives up there, and also on an elderly neighbor that was kind of like the mayor of the neighborhood when my kids were little. So it's based on him a little bit. And then I do pull in actual things that happened, things that are interesting. Truth is stranger than fiction. That's a true statement, even though it's a cliche. And then in The Field, so my kids were in high school when I wrote it, and I got some really great ideas from things that happened to them and their friends. And so that was fun. It's not about my children, although when they were in high school, they couldn't read it because they're like, oh, this is too much like me. But now they realize, no, it's really not. It's not them at all. And then Catalyst is maybe the least based on things that are true in my life, although I did do a lot of research for Catalyst. I drove, so the archaeological dig site is called Angel Mound, and there is a dig site in southern Indiana by Evansville called Angel Mound, and I went there, and so it's kind of loosely based on that, but also there was a real dig that I went and observed, like an active dig that I went and observed. Indiana University was having it. That was outside of St. Louis, and I used a lot of that. And then there's a mound called Cahokia Mound, which is also outside of St. Louis. So I sort of melded all those in together. So real things come into play, and then I often fictionalize them. But yeah, there's a T-shirt that I've seen authors wear that says something like, "Be nice to me, or you may appear in my book."
Yes. My aunt has a friend who is an author, and she was house sitting for her once, and I went to visit my aunt, and the woman has a sign in her living room that says, "Be nice, you may appear in one of my books." So.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that's interesting about that is what my church has an auction for a program in Africa where it's called the Emoja Project, where they're helping with schools and hospitals and supporting the students. And they had this auction, and she had the great idea of auctioning off that someone, if they won this prize, that they could be a character in one of my books. So the fellow just won, and I was just talking with him, and I just wrote him into the book, and he's really excited about it. It was fun to do. So
that's really cool.
Yeah,
very fun. Yeah. So you're working on the fourth book now.
Yes.
When did you start writing? Is it something that you've always wanted to do?
So I started writing when my kids were in late elementary school and middle school. And really it was because I started rereading all the books that I loved as a child, like the Narnia series and Madeleine L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time and all of her books. And then I just started getting ideas for stories. And I thought, well, I'll give this a try. I was not always wanting to be a writer. I know many writers or authors that was their dream, but that was not my dream. But I have always been a list maker, which isn't the same thing, but I always categorize things. And I'm, like I said earlier, I'm a very creative person. So, and writing for me, it's you create your own world. I get to make stuff up, and it's very fun. So yeah, so it took me quite a while to write Indian Summer, and then like I said earlier as well, I didn't go into it thinking, oh, this is going to be a series and this is what's going to happen. But it's almost like the books are out there in the ether space somewhere. And then when the time comes, they just sort of become apparent to me. And it's like, okay, now it's time for me to write the field, or okay, now Catalyst, here's what's going to happen in this particular book. So I enjoy writing. I know some people are like, oh, it's so hard. And it isn't hard. You just have to be, for me at least, in the right frame of mind to do it. I can't just, sit down and start writing. I have to take me a while to get going. But it's something that I really love, but not something that I ever thought I would do now.
Fascinating and fun. So
yeah.
So then,
yeah.
Out of your own experience, would you have advice for other authors or aspiring authors? Excuse me.
Well, so two things as far as that goes, because people do ask me that all the time. Whenever I'm at a book event, people will say, oh, I want to write a book, or I have a book to write, or, what should I do? And then I might see those same people the next year, and they'll still say, well, I have a book to write, and they haven't done it. Or I belong to the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, and a lot of the people who are in that group are published, but there are a lot of aspiring authors as well. And the most important thing is butt in chair. You actually have to write the book. And I've talked about this with my publisher. I mean, it sounds rather obvious, right? But if you don't make it a discipline and sit down either every weekend or every day or whatever works for you and actually write the book, it's never going to get done. So that's an obvious but not always acted upon piece of advice. And then the other thing is never give up, because getting published and writing, it's hard, it's work. I mean, even though you might really enjoy it and you have a book that in your head that you want to write, it's still work. And there's a series of books that I love by Megan Whalen Turner. It's the Thief series. The first one came out, I think, in 1996, maybe, and the last one just came out this past fall. And my son and I read them together. And there's a character in the book who is the thief. His name is Eugenides, and his shortened name is Jen. And in one of the books, another character says of him, says Jen never loses. He may suffer setbacks. He may suffer defeat. He may not accomplish what he wants, but he never, ever gives up until he wins. And so my son and I, when we have a problem or we're dealing with something, we'll say, be like Jen. Never give up until you get what you want. And so it might take a long time, but you just got to keep working at it and not get discouraged. In fact, my brother, who's also an author, he sent an article to my son and I, and it basically said that most authors stop at one or two books. There are not that many authors that have 3, 4, 5 and more books, because they just kind of get burnt out or they stop. But Anne Lamott, who's another author, had said sometimes it takes maybe 3 or 4 books until you actually get caught on, until your books get the attention of the people that you're wanting to reach. So you have to look at it as a process and enjoy the process and just keep working at it.
Thank you. And also, that's your first piece of advice was very mean. What do you mean it's not going to write itself?
It's magic.
That's right. I just don't know what to say to that. You've mentioned some of the authors that you read, but when you take the time to read for yourself, who are your go-to authors and genres?
Well, so I have a lot of books that I love. I do like suspense and mystery. I love fantasy, supernatural, sci-fi. So Madeleine L'Engle is kind of my muse. She was one of my favorites from the beginning. So I love all of her books. E.L. Konigsberg, these are older books. She wrote From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Franken. I can't even think of what it is. It was published back in the 60s.
Frankweiler.
Yeah, Basil Frankweiler. I love her books. She's written some other books that are just so powerful and meaningful. And then Kristen Britton wrote the Green Rider series, which I loved. I discovered them and just ran through. I think there were 6 books, and she's writing the 7th. Loved those. And then Megan Whalen Turner, who I mentioned, her books, the Thief series, are so well crafted and so fabulous. Love those. For sci-fi, I've read books by Amy Kaufman. I'm drawing a blank on some other books. But I just watched on Netflix, they had Dash and Lily, a movie on, which is based on a book by Rachel Cohen and David Levithan called Dash and Lily's Book of Dares. So these are YA. I read a lot of YA. I write YA. I read a lot of YA. I read other books too, but and so I realized that I didn't know that there had been a sequel, Dash and Lily, 12 Days of Dash and Lily, and now another one called Dash and Lily Mind the Gap. So now they're in London. So I just got those books from the library, and I'm excited because they're kind of Christmassy. So I'm going to be reading those over the holidays. So I read a lot of different books. I'm reading American Dirt right now, which is really powerful, and I'm enjoying that quite a bit. So I read a lot of different stuff, but YA is probably my favorite. And I think it's because it's such a formative time in people's lives, and there just seems like there's so many possibilities that for young people, and I really enjoy that genre.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. You get a lot of the hero's journey and those types of tropes in young adults, and
yes,
watching them
exactly.
grow and learn. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question, though. Question. So when I was talking earlier about how every time I talk with an interviewer or a reader, not every time, but most times, and I talk about this idea of intuition or connecting with the collective consciousness, often they have a story. One of the interviewers said he had a premonition about 9/11, and he talked about it on the radio before it happened. I think he had a dream about it. He didn't know what it was. And then it happened. And so it was actually on the radio for him to be able to refer back and say, yeah, this did happen. So I wondered if you had ever had any kind of experiences with that happening to you.
Nothing to that extent, more of just smaller things where, you kind of feel like you know what's going to happen like a split second before it happens, or maybe a couple of minutes, you just have this feeling of, oh shoot, something is coming.
Yeah.
But nothing major like that. I mean, that's pretty powerful, the dream.
That's a pretty big
imagine
one. Yeah.
really scary.
And well, the thing is, like, what could he have done with that information? He didn't really know what was going to happen. He just had some idea. So yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I had an experience one time where I was out visiting my brother. He lives in Northern California, and I was going to watch his 2 kids while he and his wife took a little vacation. So he said, you can take them to this, it's an indoor, like, bouncy castle house, sort of, one of those inflatable things. So I thought, okay, great. I will take them there. But I thought, I bet, I wonder what would happen if Ben, my nephew, broke his arm, And so I thought about that, and then it sort of flew out of my head. But then, so I dropped them off, and I went into town, and I had dinner, and I was drinking a glass of wine, and I'm talking to the gal at the bar sitting next to me, and my phone rings, and I thought, oh, there it is. They're calling me to tell me he broke his arm. And he did. He had broken his arm. And afterwards, I thought, well, should I have not taken them to the bouncy place? And I think that one thing that happens to Eric in the book, because he has premonitions about things that are going to happen, and after they do happen, he thinks, well, should I have done something? Was it wrong not to act on it? Because he didn't really even know what the premonitions meant. And I think that the clear message that I was trying to share was, you can't blame yourself. You can't know what the premonitions are necessarily, but you can. It's like a muscle. You can work on developing that skill, that connection.
I've said it before, and I will say it again. This is why I ask the questions, because you see how I get all like, blah, 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 when somebody asks me a question. Yes, that is a word, or a feeling, or a word feeling, a wheeling, a furred, I don't know. At any rate, it's time for our last break of the podcast. When we come back, you can look forward to another strange story from my past, this involving me taking the garbage out in Pennsylvania. Yeah, stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Tracy Richardson.
Yeah, well, I mean, and some of them really, what could you do? You know, do you not
Right.
take your nephew to the bouncy house? I had
Right.
something once, I mean, just really minor, where I was driving somewhere and I had to stop, and so I got out of my car to throw something away, and just as I closed the trunk where I'd gotten what I was throwing away, I thought, oh, haha, wouldn't it be funny if I locked my keys in the car? Well, guess what? The doors had locked behind me, and, you know, had I not closed the trunk, I could have crawled through and gotten the keys. My car is running, of course. And, you know, that something like that could be like, yes, maybe if you have that thought, you should check, because that's something more tangible than just.
Oh, yeah. My ex-husband one time was driving downtown in Indianapolis for a dentist appointment, and it was snowy out, and he had this clear message in his head, don't park on the street. Well, he ignored it and parked on the street instead of parking in the parking garage under the building. And after the dentist appointment, he came out and someone had plowed into the back of the van. And he thought, you need to pay attention to those thoughts when they come into your head. There's another really cool story about this connection that we have through this collective consciousness. So the author Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, and other books as well, she met Anne Patchett, who's another famous author who wrote The Dutch House and Bel Canto, and owns a bookstore in Tennessee. They met and became friends at a book conference, and then they sort of became friends ongoing and were communicating with one another. During that time when they were apart, Elizabeth had been working on a book, and then her husband at the time had left the country and wasn't able to get back in the country because he's from Bali or somewhere else. So she had to deal with that for quite a long time. And when she came back to writing the book, the idea had just escaped her. She lost it. She didn't know what happened to it. So when she met up with Anne, the next time they met, they were talking, and Anne said, or Elizabeth said, what are you working on? What are you writing right now? And Anne said, no, you tell me first. So Elizabeth told her about the book that she had been writing, but she had lost it. And she said it was about this woman that lived in Minnesota. She was a secretary to the president of a company. It was maybe a pharmaceutical company. She had to go to South America because of, I can't remember the reason why, but it was with the company. And she ended up falling in love and having an adventure. And Anne was like, you are effing kidding me. No, that can't be right. Because she said, that's the book I'm writing. And this is the book that Elizabeth had lost. The idea had just disappeared. So, but Anne was writing the exact same book. And I don't know which book, and it got published, and I don't know which book it was. There were some minor differences, but they postulated that the idea from Elizabeth got transferred to Anne somehow when they were talking over that time. So pretty freaky, but
Yeah,
there's a lot of evidence that sort of thing happens.
I just spoke with, a couple of weeks ago, the author I interviewed was Hank Philippi Ryan, and she writes psychological thrillers. And she was having dinner with another author, and I can't remember who the author was, somebody fairly well known, but they had pretty much the same conversation. He told her what book she was writing. She was writing the same book. I mean, obviously it's going to be a different book because it's two different authors, but they had the same, almost exactly the same premise.
Isn't that wild? And you talk about that in terms of discoveries too. So they'll have discoveries of like the AC/DC current, or I don't know what other discovery, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but it will not have been discovered, and then all of a sudden there'll be like 3 or 4 people working on the same thing at the same time. And the idea that people postulate is that somewhere out in the ether, in this collective consciousness, the idea is floating around, and people sort of are connecting to it. So it's fascinating.
It is fascinating. We could probably talk about that for a very long time as well.
Yeah.
But I'll turn to a more practical question, which is, I know you have a website, so if you can tell people where to find that, as well as where they can connect with you on social media.
Yeah, so my website is www.tracy, Tracy, richardsonauthor.com. And there's all kinds of links there to my different social media pages and buy links for my books. I'm on Facebook, Tracy Richardson Author, and I'm on Instagram as Tracy Richardson Author, and I'm on Twitter. I'm not as active on Twitter. I don't really understand Twitter as well as the other ones. I need to work on that a little bit. But I think it's Author Tracy Rich is my Twitter handle. And then on my website, there's a contact me page, so you can always send me an email that way. And then on Goodreads, I'm on Goodreads as well.
Okay, thank you for that.
I'd love to hear from readers.
Yeah, we've talked about a lot of different topics today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you would really like to mention at this point?
Well, I guess to circle back to the Catalyst series, the title Catalyst comes from the idea that Marcy and her friends are catalysts for change. And so the thing I want to emphasize to your listeners and to readers is that we can all be catalysts for whatever it is that we would like to see happen. We can be catalysts for change. There's a premise mostly in Catalyst, the book, that thoughts are things, that thoughts have power, and they're the most powerful thing in the universe. And there's a lot of evidence about prayer having an impact on, they look at it mostly in terms of helping people with healing. And you don't have to call it prayer if you don't like that word. You can call it intention or, positive energy, whatever. But there's a lot of evidence showing that has an impact. So I would like to just have your listeners know that we can make a difference. Our thoughts and actions do have an impact, and even as small as we think we are. I mean, that's why everyone keeps talking about go out and vote, because you have one vote, but all of our votes together are hugely impactful. So,
yeah, I mean, the most number of votes in history, it was amazing, the number of people who voted this year.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. Well, Tracy, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me not only about the book Catalyst, but also about the Catalyst series. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you once again to Tracy Richardson for talking to me about her books in the Catalysts series. The one that we mainly focused on today was Catalyst, which is the second book in this series. And thank you for talking to me about fantasy and climate change and all sorts of things, and for putting up with my somewhat random stories about Battlestar Galactica and Pennsylvania and locking my keys in the car. Oh, good times. Yeah. I do love conversations with authors, and I do love that they put up with my random stories and comments. If you are a fan of young adult, of science fiction, fantasy, climate change, all kinds of good genre crossing genres, that made no sense, but you know what I mean, multiple genres in present in one book, then you should definitely check out not only Catalyst but the other books in the Catalyst series. You can find those books on Amazon and anywhere that you buy your books. Definitely keep supporting those independent bookstores. We're working on getting out of this pandemic, but those independent bookstores still definitely need your help. So I bet if they don't have it, they can order it for you if you want to order it from your favorite independent bookstore. At any rate, it is time to wrap this up. I hope that you will join me next time when I am speaking with author Shelley Blanton Stroud about her book Copy Boy. It is historical fiction. It is a story of reinvention. There's a lot. There's some mystery and intrigue and all kinds of good stuff. So definitely join me for that. Again, it's called Copy Boy. The author is Shelley Blanton Stroud. In the meantime, if you're a fan of this podcast and you'd like to help us out, you can do that in a couple of ways. You can follow us on social media. You can find us at GSMC Book Review on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Twitter has an _GSMC_ book review just to make things interesting. But please do find us on social media and let me know your stories, what you're reading, what you want to read, what you have read in the past, etc. I love stories about books. And tell me about any of those experiences that you've had where you had a bit of a sixth sense and you knew something that was either going to happen or was happening somewhere else. Share those with me and I can share them with Tracy, or you can find her on her social media that she talked about toward the end of the interview, and you can share those stories with her. You can also write a review or give us a nice 5-star review. That helps us to get the podcast out to more people who love books. And of course, subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you like to listen to this podcast on. Thank you for that in advance. And thank you as always for being amazing, wonderful listeners and readers. You're great, wonderful, awesome, amazing, and other adjectives that you can throw in there. Thanks again for listening. Join me next time, but in the meantime, I hope you have lots of time to get yourself lost in a good book.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.